Chapter 8 Friends in Secret Places. Every time Joseph went in or out of the gates of the walled town of Rothenburg, he reflected on his good fortune. He was earning good money as a caretaker and by doing other jobs for Herr Geldmann at his cottage outside of town. And because he didn't have to pay for rent for staying at the cottage, his savings multiplied quickly. He also proved to be a quick study when the old Jewish banker took him under his wing and shared principles of finance and investment with him. Under the old man's tutelage, he began to successfully build his own small fortune, something he'd never dreamed of before meeting the banker. Because Joseph was easily overlooked by most of the townsfolk due to his impoverished past, no one even suspected his relationship with Geldmann. And he was wise enough to keep his improved financial situation to himself. The old man would smilingly tell him that while it's good to have friends in high places, it's sometimes more helpful to have friends in secret places. But while things went from good to better for Heinrich, Irmgard, Frigga, and Joseph, the situation grew increasingly uncomfortable for Herr Geldmann. There were no further beatings after the one that sent him to the hospital where he'd met Joseph, but the feelings of hostility and mistrust toward him were palpable. He was no longer greeted warmly in the streets. When he greeted others, he either received a silent nod or a curt "Grüß Gott" in return. Shopkeepers still took his money, but gave him nothing but their wares in return. There was no chatter or exchange of pleasantries. He heard the whispered murmurings and false accusations. They were spoken in low voices, but it seemed that they were deliberately spoken just loud enough for him to hear. What could he do anyway? He couldn't make someone like him or trust him, and any altercation, even a verbal one, could easily lead to him being arrested or beaten, or both. It was obvious that his repossession of properties, rare as it was, had resulted in ill feelings. He thought it bitterly ironic that none of the borrowers had batted an eye when agreeing to the terms of the loan. They were eager to borrow money from him. And although he had tried to work out solutions that would allow clients to keep possession of their properties once they fell behind in payments, some of them were simply hopeless when it came to matters of finance. Their poor choices led them to bitterness toward the one they thought had caused their plight. Geldmann was not alone in his predicament. He had spoken to other Jews in town who were receiving the same kind of treatment. They were frightened. While they possessed financial means, they had no one who would advocate for them. Some were already talking of moving away. Geldmann shook his head. History had a way of repeating itself, at least for the Jews. As he shambled back to his house, he noticed a piece of parchment tacked to his door. It was yet another picture of a Judensau with the cruel characterizations of Jews engaged in abominable acts with a pig. He looked down at the base of his door and saw a pile of feces, obviously not left by an animal, at least not one that went on 4 legs. He unlocked the door, went in, and relocked it with a sigh. Later that evening, as he lay upstairs in bed, he heard the unmistakable sound of breaking glass from below. Lighting a lantern, he made his way down the stairs to the front window. Beneath the smashed window was a rock with a crudely painted message: Juden raus, Jews out. His blood chilled, and he slept no more that night. The next morning, Geldmann didn't walk down to his bank building as usual. He sat in his study to review his plans. He had known for some time that the social climate in Rothenburg was growing worse. It had started long before he had been beaten at night on the streets. He'd known that people had been tracking his movements. They knew when he would be alone. He'd long been aware of their animosity toward him, even though he'd been a model citizen and had been responsible for many of the improvements made to the town. He was, however, somewhat of a student of history. He knew that no matter where Jews settled, or how much they caused others around them to prosper, they would eventually be driven out. It had already happened at least twice in Rothenburg. He knew it was only a matter of time before it happened again. But how much time did he have? That was why Samual Geldmann had spent a long time making a contingency plan. While his bank held an adequate amount of gold to sustain his business in Rothenburg, he had regularly put aside significant amounts that he had been sending to Strasbourg for years. Of course, the gold had been cleverly hidden in his shipments of other goods and false compartments of wagons and carriages. Geldmann, however, was not stealing from his clients. The gold he was sending to Strasbourg was his personal wealth, acquired over many years. But he knew that when push came to shove, many of the townsfolk would assume that it was their gold. Like Rothenburg, Strasbourg was an imperial city and enjoyed a certain amount of independence. While the Jews in Strasbourg had endured many of the same outrages as the Jews in Rothenburg, including being accused of the same crime of poisoning the water, Geldmann had heard that there was more tolerance there. To be honest, at the time, Jews weren't allowed to stay in Strasbourg overnight. They had to leave the city by 10 o'clock at night. But rumor had it that no one bothered them in the nearby villages and towns where they lived. He had transferred quite enough wealth to friends and relatives in the Strasbourg area to make a new start and live out the rest of his days in relative comfort and security, assuming he could make it there. Ah, there was the rub. He had a few more details to take care of, and he couldn't simply pack up a wagon and drive out of town. He knew that if he tried that, he would be stopped, beaten, stripped of his possessions, and probably executed under some trumped-up charges. With the increase of open hostility toward him evident, Geldmann knew that he would need to move quickly. The rock through his window had been the final warning. He knew the time had come to leave. But how would he make his escape undetected? He knew it was important to keep up a modicum of normalcy, so the next day he dressed for work and walked to the bank. Upon arrival, he apologized for his absence the previous day and blamed stomach problems from spoiled meat for keeping him away. He then went about a normal day of work, although he rarely engaged anyone in anything but the briefest of conversations. After closing the bank for the day, He made his way to the Haus der Nachtwächter under the pretense of having dinner and a tankard of ale. His real purpose was to engage Heinrich, Irmgard, and Frigga in conversation. He was confident that Joseph would be there to see Frigga as well. At least he could still count on young love. The common room at the inn was not as crowded as he had expected. Aside from one large table full of boisterous diners and drinkers, hardly anyone was there. The loud group was sufficiently in their cups and oblivious of other occupants of the room, except when their tankards needed refilling. That allowed Geldmann to select a smaller table in the corner. The loud voices from the big table provided good cover, but Geldmann and his friends could still hear one another as they spoke in lowered voices. Heinrich and Irmgard greeted the banker quietly as he told them, "This is perhaps the last time that we shall speak together as a group. Things have become untenable for me, and I fear that your further association with me, at least openly, will be to your detriment. I do want you to pass on what I tell you to my dear friends Joseph and Frigga, but I fear it is too dangerous for all of us to be seen conversing together." His comments were met with slight nods and gazes that accepted the truth of what he was saying. He asked Irmgard to bring him food and some ale. "I'm really not hungry, but we need to keep up impressions," he whispered. When Irmgard returned with both food and beverage, Geldmann continued, "Things have reached the point of no turning back for me. Although I regret it with all my heart, I must leave Rothenburg. But I know people are watching me. They have already attacked my house. They know where I go and with whom I converse. I need to leave, but I will need your help to do so. The town council will surely not allow an old rich Jew to leave unnoticed." Heinrich nodded and responded, "As a banker, Samuel, you will immediately be missed. People will ask after you. They may even pursue you on the road and bring you back. Do you have a plan?" "That is the purpose of my visit here tonight," replied the banker. "I need the perspective of others before I make my final plans. I believe I will only have one chance to get this right, and if I involve you, the cost is too great to fail. Here is what I propose." After making sure that Frigga was keeping the large table of boisterous patrons adequately supplied with ale, Geldmann continued, "I need to disappear, but I need a place to hide for a few days after my disappearance, to throw my pursuers off my trail." "But how will you disappear?" interjected Irmgard. "It's not like you can just go up in a puff of smoke, like an illusion from one of the street magicians. Do you have a plan?" "I do," replied the old banker, "and I'll get to that. But I need to find a place to hide for a few days after I disappear. Is that something you can help me with?" "Well," replied Irmgard, "Frigga does have an extra room in her living quarters above the kitchen. There's a separate stairway from the kitchen to her rooms. Nobody would see you coming or going." "That's perfect," the old Jew replied, "providing young Frigga is willing to hide an old man for a few days. I would try to hide out in the cottage with Joseph, but that's too obvious. It's the first place they would look for me." "I have known Frigga all of my life," said Irmgard. "I know that she will be willing to help." With a silent nod, Geldmann responded, "Then let me tell you the rest of my plan. When I return here in 2 nights, Please ask Frigga to make sure that the large table is full of guests and amply supplied with ale. I will pay for it if the guests are unable, he smiled. We want them focused on themselves and their drinks and not on us that night. At the same time, we want them to know and to remember that I was there. He spoke for a few more minutes and watched them nodding their heads in agreement. Then he quietly rose from the table and made his way to the door. Not a single person from the large and loud table in the middle of the room even noticed his leaving. They were too full of themselves and of ale to pay attention. Heinrich and Irmgard retreated to the kitchen and began to fill Frigga in on the details. Josef had not yet arrived, so they asked her to make sure he understood the plan as well. A few more people wandered in off the street and began calling for dinner and ale. It was as if nothing unusual had happened. 2 nights later, as arranged, Samual Geldmann arrived in the inn late in the evening, obviously in a foul mood. Uncharacteristically, he demanded food and ale. "And don't let the ale be lacking," he shouted. "I'm not in a patient mood." The other patrons, many of whom knew the old banker, raised an eyebrow at this unusual outburst. Most of the other patrons didn't seem to notice that whenever Geldmann ordered more ale, it ended up on their tables rather than on his. It didn't seem to register with them that their steins never ran dry. And those few who did notice weren't about to bring it to the serving wench's attention that they were drinking ale for which they had not paid. The old man's temperament didn't improve as the late evening progressed. He kept demanding more ale, which found its way to the tables of the already well-lubricated patrons. He occasionally raised his slurred voice in complaint. "How can they do this to me? I've been a pillar of this community for years." Those that remained were sufficiently under the influence of their own imbibing that they didn't notice that when Frigga or Irmgard brought more ale, none of it found its way into the banker's cup. And to be honest, they didn't pay much attention to what he was saying, although it was obvious to them that he was extremely agitated. It was fairly late when the old Jew called out, "Zahlen," asking for his check. He pulled out his purse and clumsily spilled all the coins on the table. Frigga feigned being flustered and gathered up the appropriate amount and then handed the rest back. "Thank you for your continued patronage, Herr Geldmann," she called out as he staggered to the door. The Jewish banker glared at her before yanking the door open and then slamming it behind him as he exited. Once outside, the banker quickly and quietly glanced around and made his way to the back of the inn and to the kitchen entrance. Heinrich was waiting there for him and silently let him in and pointed him to the stairs that led to Frigga's rooms. As quietly as possible, the old man made his way upstairs and disappeared. Back in the common room, one of the remaining patrons wondered loudly, "What's the matter with the old Jew? He seems out of sorts tonight." "I guess that's what happens when you prey on innocent people and take away their homes. It comes back to haunt you. He's probably on his way out to practice some filthy Jewish ceremony that demeans and disgraces the church." "I'm sure I don't know," replied Irmgard. "I've never seen him act this way before. Something must be troubling him. I even heard him say that perhaps the Tauber River holds the only solution for him. I have no idea what he means by that." "Ah, the old fool is probably threatening to drown himself in the Tauber," replied the barely sober guest. "Lots of people talk about it, but hardly anyone ever does it." Irmgard stole a knowing glance at Heinrich and Frigga. No nod was necessary. The bait had been taken. The following morning, Herr Geldmann didn't show up for work at his bank. There was a fresh scrawl of anti-Jewish sentiment on the door of his house, but appeared that no one had entered. Knocks upon the door and repeated shouts calling for him to open the door had elicited no response. Later that day, a man who had been fishing in the Tauber Valley brought a cloak, a boot, a purse laden with gold coins, and a waterlogged copy of the Torah into town. No one noticed that the man was a friend of Heinrich's, who lived in the village below Rothenburg along the Tauber River. Nor did they notice the extra coins jingling in his pockets as he walked back out of the gates of the town. Geldmann's disappearance caused much consternation among the wealthier members of the community. Many of them, after all, had money in Geldmann's bank. Naturally, the members of the town council were not quite ready to accept that Geldmann had died. They insisted on interviewing the patrons of the Nachtwächter who had been at the inn on the night of Geldmann's disappearance. They all corroborated the same story. A drunken and distraught Geldmann had stormed out of the inn and made noises about ending his life in the waters of the Tauber River that night. The council finally accepted, grudgingly, that a drunken Geldmann had stumbled down into the valley and had drowned in the river. The council agreed that they would meet later to decide what to do about the assets remaining at Geldmann's bank. Although nothing specific was said, it was understood that what remained of Geldmann's wealth would somehow end up in their purses. Geldmann, still very much alive and dry as a bone, remained in Frigga's spare room through the night, waiting for the furor to subside. He and his fellow conspirators were waiting for the final act in their play. Heinrich, as it turned out, had never surrendered his night watchman uniform. It remained in his wardrobe. As fortune would have it, he and Geldmann were approximately the same size. Heinrich was a bit stouter than the old Jew, but it was unlikely that anyone would notice. Besides, Geldmann would have several layers of clothing beneath the cloak. He wouldn't be able to carry any kind of pack with him. Heinrich's hat fit him surprisingly well. The hellebarde completed the disguise. Heinrich recalled how often that the hellebarde was often the only thing people saw when he approached. For good measure, they put the horn around his neck and the lantern in his hand. After a final look at the dressed-up Jew, Heinrich commented, "If you don't have to speak much, you'll easily pass for a night watchman. Just remember, you belong out there, and you won't take nonsense from anybody. People may not respect you during the daylight hours, but when it's dark, you command their attention." "Are you sure the path will be clear for me?" asked the worried banker. "I can keep up appearances for a while, but if another of the night watchmen comes across me, I don't know that I'll fool them." "Trust me," said Heinrich. "I did this job for 10 years. At the end of the shift, all the watchmen want to go home and go to bed. They arrange their routes so that they'll finish close to home. Nobody among the night watchmen lives anywhere near the front gate, and nobody will question a night watchman stepping out of the gates when they are opened at sunrise. They'll assume he's got some second job somewhere on one of the farms outside of the town. With a final look at his fellow conspirators, Geldmann smiled wryly and said, "You know, I once told Joseph that it's good to have friends in high places, but nothing surpasses having good friends in secret places. I will never be able to thank you enough or to repay you for your kindness." With that, the old Jewish banker opened the kitchen door of the inn. It was still very early in the morning, and the sun had not yet risen. He walked confidently to the front gate, arriving just a few moments before dawn. As the first rays of sunlight hit the town, the gates were opened. Geldmann strode through confidently, as if headed for his second job on some farm outside the walls. No one challenged him. No one even noticed him. They were too preoccupied with the people coming in to do business for the day in town. Later that day, the town council met to consider what to do with Geldmann's bank. That they would repossess it and thereby profit was a foregone conclusion. But when they went to the bank and forced open the doors, they were met by a significant surprise. Despite searching the bank thoroughly, they found very little gold. Interestingly, all the funds belonging to the local merchants were still in place, and the ledgers were up to date, showing what each bank patron owned. Still, they knew that Geldmann had kept a private stash of his own gold in the vault of the bank, but there was no trace of it, and no record of where it might have gone. Infuriated, the members of the town council searched in vain for clues as to the location of Geldmann and the missing gold. A few months later, still infuriated that Geldmann had outsmarted them, though they never found any evidence, the council unleashed an edict. The remaining Jews were expelled from Rothenburg, with some even dying during this expulsion. No Jews would return to Rothenburg for more than 300 years. Somehow, life in Rothenburg went on. About a year after the expulsion of the Jews, Joseph and Frigga received a letter from Strasbourg. Its contents were sufficiently vague so as to prevent most people from deciphering their meaning. It was clear, however, that the author of the letter was well and happy and most appreciative of their friendship. There was a promise that, if possible, he would be at their disposal at their moment of need, and he would do anything within his power to help them. The letter was signed, "Your most grateful friend, in secret places."